Hey, I have to show up at the start of the video now because that's just how YouTube's new algorithm works. So, hey, welcome back, everybody. PayPal, Patreon are both down below if you want to support me. I'll do so if you actually can. And as always, if you want access to the graphs used in this video and hundreds of other similar graphs across all kinds of similar and different subjects, those are all available for free in the Drive folder linked in the description. Any financial support helps with the maintenance and upkeep of all that as well. So, as expected, the physical supply disruption and the corresponding price surge. My area, for example, for an anecdotal example, before the Iran war versus after the Iran war, this has, in most countries, resulted in at least some degree of contraction of oil consumption levels, some degree of demand destruction, which is actually why the prices and the situation as a whole is not as catastrophic as it otherwise would have been expected to be. Starting with the largest consumer in present day is still and going to remain the US. The US has been plateaued for over 2 decades at around 20, usually fluctuating up and down. Before the Iran war, it was averaging for the last month or two a bit closer to 21. Most recently, the US has actually come in down under 20 at 19.7. So, in total, over the course of a month and a half, that's roughly, because again, it was a bit below 21, that's roughly about a million in demand contraction. China, for their domestic consumption, has plateaued off in present day at around 17 million, sometimes a bit above. They were right at 17 before everything began, and over the last month and a half, it looks like they've gone down to 16.1. India is one of the ones who has not given their most up to date data. They did give data from just a little bit into the war where they had not been struck fully just yet, although they have begun contracting since then. Before their demand started to withdraw, they did cross up over the 6 million barrel per day threshold that everyone's been expecting for a while and hit a new high point of 6.04 million barrels per day. Japan was once up around 6 decades back, but they've declined down to averaging closer to 3.5 in present day because of the advent of fuel efficiency and their wholesale national adoption of it, their broad use of mass public transit, and the aging of their population as larger and larger portions of their population are aging past the typical ages of activity and work. Just before the war started, they were around 3.4 or so, and as of now, they're down at around 2.7. Russia was once up at a demand level of 5 back in the USSR times in the 80s. Just Russia within the USSR. The whole USSR was a demand level of around 7.5. But Russia itself within the USSR was about 5, dropped when the USSR collapsed, gradually climbed back up towards 4, dropped during COVID, recovered, but then dropped again in the economic fallout since invading Ukraine and has oscillated up and down. They were most recently, most likely, as they don't officially publish oil data anymore, they've declared it classified. They were most recently, most likely around 3.2. However, they have contracted down closer to 3 now over the last month and a half or so. South Korea in present day is usually around 2.8, but they're about to be tipping over and following Japan, especially given their demographic setup and the way their pyramid is heading. I was not able to get up-to-date data for them, so still have their data from about 3 weeks into the war, so about 3/4 or 2/3 of the way into last month, in which they had contracted by a few 100,000 from 2.8 down to 2.5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia in present day fluctuates between 2 and 3 under normal circumstances over the course of any given year, highest in the summer because their electricity demand surges, and they still do generate close to a third of their electricity from oil-fired power generation. However, because of reduced everything, their demand has actually not climbed up as high so far this year as it normally would by this point in the year. They would normally be up to about 2.4 right now, a little bit above, a little bit underneath. It would depend. However, they're actually still back down closer to a flat 2 million barrels per day at the moment. Brazil would probably be a bit difficult. Brazil would probably be a bit difficult at first to see any definitive effects that you could actually pin on the price surge from the war because their demand fluctuates quite a bit. Their numbers no longer stay all that consistent. Earlier this year, towards the start, they were at 2.5. And most recently, sometime last month, they were at 2.6 or a bit under 2.6. Canada in present day is usually around 2.5. And their most recent release data is from just before the war started, in which they were close to average at 2.42. Indonesia in present day has gone all the way up to averaging a domestic consumption level of between 2.2 and 2.4. And their most recent available data is from just before the war started, in which they were just under 2.2 at 2.18 million barrels per day. Germany, just before the war started, was right at 2, just above it by a few tens of thousands. And as of last was heard, they were down by a few hundred thousand, down to between 1.7 and 1.8 million barrels per day. I don't have completely up to date stuff on Mexico yet, but similar to India, I do have data from just before the effects started to hit, and Mexico had actually reached 1.86 million barrels per day for the first time in quite a while. They used to average about 2 until COVID happened, and they crashed all the way to 1 and jumped up to 1.6 pretty quickly. But since then, their demand has been a lot slower in climbing back upwards from 1.6 back up to 2. Iran in present day is usually a bit under 2, typically at 1.8. Before the war started, they were at 1.6. When when the war was in full swing, they dropped by over half down to or a bit under 700,000, as not a lot of people were really going anywhere or doing anything. However, during the ceasefire, things have picked back up internally inside the country, and they've gone back up over 1 million, and they're somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2. France in present day is usually around 1.6, and as of most recently, they are apparently roughly down closer to 1.3 because of both mandatory and voluntary demand contraction. The UK in present day is down to around 1.5 usually, and their latest data is from just before everything started, and they were at 1.52. Italy in present day has gone down from a previous peak of 2 a long time ago down to averaging more around 1.2 or 1.3. Now, though, they're down to 1.05. Spain is usually pretty steady now around 1.3, and they came in at 1.28 million barrels per day. Singapore in present day is on their decline from their peak of over 1.4, and they're down to around 1.2 or so. However, over a month into everything, they have declined by over a quarter million, down to about 936,000 barrels per day. Turkey in present day is up to usually around 1.3. This time, though, they're down just under 1.1 at 1.08. Thailand in present day is usually around 1.2. That's where they plateaued off. However, as of us being a month and a half into everything, they have contracted down to roughly around a flat 1. Australia is usually up between 1.1 and 1.2. And as of their most recent stuff from a couple weeks ago, they also contracted a little bit down to about a flat 1 also. Up next to Belgium, Nederland was previously above 1, but they've been on their way down post-COVID, and they're down to usually averaging closer to 900. Their most recent data is from before the Iran war started, when they came in at 953,000. Iraq in present day is usually around or just under a million barrels per day of domestic consumption, and since everything began, they have declined their way down to current demand levels of 700,000. Taiwan in present day has declined from the plateau of about 1 million that they stayed at for about 2 decades down to averaging more around 850 or between 850 and 900. Most recently, however, they came in down at 705. Malaysia in present day is usually between 800 and 900. However, as of a month and a half into everything now, it's contracted down to about 700,000. Egypt in present day is getting close to, under normal circumstances, a domestic consumption level of 1 million barrels per day, and we're even up at around 980 and 960 recently. However, as of their most recent data from a week or two ago, it looks like they have contracted down by some bit so far, down to about 830. Poland in present day is up to about 800. However, they came in at 700,000. Vietnam in present day usually averages up in the mid 700s, getting closer to 800, and they have contracted thus far down to under 550, coming in most recently at 544. Argentina in present day is usually somewhere around 700 or 800. It fluctuates depending on how stable they are. More recently, they were higher, closer to 800. However, in light of everything, they have contracted down some bit, down to between 700 and 710,000. Nigeria in present day has been starting to average more around 700 after climbing up from 600 over the course of a few years. And before the war started, they actually came in close to 800 again, hitting 791. However, a month and a half into the war, it looks like they're down somewhere fluctuating between 550 and 600. Belgium, most recent data is from before the war started, and they were at 636,000 barrels per day. Colombia in present day has gotten up to, under normal circumstances, averaging over 500,000 barrels per day of domestic consumption. However, a month and a half into everything, it looks like they're down closer to 400 now. Philippines in present day is usually around or now starting to get a bit above 500,000. However, at their government's urging, everyone in the Philippines has been doing their best to try to use as little as possible across all forms, and they've come in down more around 380. Algeria in present day is up to usually about 500,000, and their most recent data is from before the war, where they came in at 471. The UAE, I should have had up higher on the list, as it's usually in descending order of consumption level, but I wrote it wrong on the notepad. They, in present day, are usually up to 1.2, and it thankfully looks like they're leveling off there. However, a month and a half into everything, they are still staying down at only about half levels, it looks like, with domestic consumption around 600,000. Chile, in present day, is plateauing off at about 400, and their most recent levels are from before the war. They came in at 382. Sweden, in present day, has declined from 400 down to about 300 on average. This time they came in at 307, and those were pre-war numbers. Greece is usually at about 300 in present day, and their most recent numbers are pre-war at 246,000. Portugal in present day is usually around 250, and their most recent numbers were also pre-war, but they were already down at 203. And then everybody left is pre-war numbers still from February, and everybody left is also on the list of countries who average usually roughly around 200, some a bit under it, some a bit above it. Austria came in at 222. The Czech Republic came in at 216,000. Hungary, even outside of the war, was way down at 152. Switzerland was almost right at 200 at 198. Norway was at 212, and Finland was down decently at 165. All right, that's it. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. There's hundreds of other videos and streams and everything you can watch if you want to. PayPal, Patreon, and the YouTube super thanks, whatever button are all down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. The link to the Drive folder with these graphs and all kinds of other graphs is available for free. That link's in the description below. There's a link in the top pinned comment to my cat's channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.